One of the difficult things about making a history podcast is the human element of history. And you'll hear various history podcasters and history people talking about this, and it's been included more and more, I feel like, over the last decade or so. But the idea is you don't necessarily want to have a total bird's eye view from 30,000 feet all the time. For me, at least, I feel like I don't want to have a podcast that is just focusing on dates and names and events, and it kind of just sounds like you're reading a Wikipedia page when you're doing the podcast. I'm not saying that style of history or that style of podcast isn't useful and at times even great, but I do think it's important to also focus on what ordinary people were going through at the times of those dates and names and events. There's definitely something interesting and engaging about experiencing the way that the average person or the ordinary person experienced and went through these traumatic and incredible historical events. But sometimes it can be hard deciding what elements of that human factor to include and what elements not to include, and then how do we judge the human emotions and the feelings involved. So the more I do this history podcast, the more I sometimes think that the human element of things and the way that evokes feelings and emotions can sometimes be exploited. I think this is kind of a difficult thing to explain, and I'm trying to conceptualize it here, but I guess the idea is that I want to remain conscious of the fact that I don't want to be using someone else's tragedy of a real person who lived and the incredible emotions and the human element that they went through. I don't want to use that human feeling as sort of a means to an end to make a point about history that particular person might not agree with, and most of the time there's really no way of knowing how they would want their memory and their experience to be remembered. I guess I kind of put myself in those shoes of maybe somebody who lived in the past, or maybe just thinking to myself, if somebody 50 years in the future was using my story, how would I want my story remembered, and how would I want my story to be used in the context of a bigger historical narrative? Obviously, I would care if somebody was using my story, my life, as a way to promote hate or racism or bigotry or war or any of the things that I don't believe in. But I also might care if somebody was using my story as a way to promote their own agenda and maybe spin things into a narrative that kind of feels like I'm being exploited in a way. Recently, I've been reading and listening to things about archaeology and how historians and archaeologists and geneticists go into these ancient settlements that are often located on the lands of indigenous peoples. And in the past, historians and archaeologists and so on and so forth would just go in, they would take the data and take the evidence and scoop up the remains that they needed, and then they would just kind of be out. And oftentimes the indigenous peoples there would express frustration that they were happy to work together while they were in the process of collecting the evidence and basically when they were needed. But then once the dust was settled and these archaeologists and historians got what they needed, then that relationship with those indigenous peoples no longer existed. And I guess one of the complaints was that this relationship between historians, archaeologists, and the indigenous peoples felt like it was more exploiting than anything else. And of course, nowadays, historians and archaeologists and everybody involved are working in a much more collaborative way with indigenous peoples, and it's much more of a relationship that goes beyond just the data and the evidence. And to me, at least, this feels like a more ethical way for history and evidence and data from ancient humanity to kind of be uncovered. Of course, as I was listening to all of this, I was applying that same concept to the way I do my history podcast. I do a handful of episodes every now and then that are more abstract and philosophical, but I think most of the time I'm really trying to dial into this ordinary person perspective and this idea that history is really nothing more than the cumulative lives that have been lived by every human that's ever been on the planet. So this human element is so important to what I'm doing, but I'm also thinking about this way that the relationship can be exploitative. Are the sources I'm using and the firsthand accounts I'm using, are those being used in the service of, first of all, the truth? And second of all, am I using those accounts to actually say something that isn't just for the purposes of shock and awe, or the purposes of, look how crazy this historical event was, type of thing? As an example, let's say you're looking at a battle in World War I, and you have 100 accounts of soldiers in the trenches during one of these 3 or 4 or 5 month long battles. And let's say you find this account that is incredibly poignant, and it's sad and traumatic and all of the things that sort of stir up emotions in people and the type of thing that really makes a story more interesting. Well, I think that's great, but I do think you also have to look at the rest of the accounts and the overall context of the battle. And I think if that account is in the service of the closest version of the truth that you can find, then I think it makes it more powerful, and I think it makes it less exploitative using that account. So it has to match up with the truth, at least as close to the truth as you can get. But I also think it has to match up with the actual person leaving the account. Obviously, there's subjectivity here, and there's a little bit of projection and guesswork, but would that person want you to be using this account in your podcast or your documentary or your movie or your book? I don't know if there's any way to come to the answer to that, but that's a question I've become more and more interested in recently. In the same way that some of those indigenous peoples felt exploited by the way that archaeology and the genetics of the whole prehistoric man thing went down, would people from the past who no longer have a voice, would they feel exploited by the way that you are using that historical account? So for me, at least, increasingly, that's sort of the two-part checklist when I look to use something from an ordinary person or an average account, or I look to get that human element in a story that I'm trying to tell. Is it in service of the truth, one? And two, do I think that person would agree or approve of the way I'm using it, what I'm trying to say, and the overall context of the argument that I'm making? Probably the prime candidate or the peak example of the human element in a podcast that I've done is back in those World War I episodes I did. There was a letter written home from a soldier, a British soldier by the name of Captain Charles May. And if you didn't listen to that episode, you can go back and check it out. Dan Carlin also uses this in his amazing Blueprint for Armageddon World War I series. You can check that out. It's in Peter Hart's amazing book, The Great War. And I think you can just Google it and find the letter. But it's just this amazing letter of this ordinary dude who knows he's going over the top at the Battle of the Somme, one of the worst horror shows in human history. And he just writes this letter home where he says goodbye to his wife and his kid. It's incredibly sad. It's incredibly poignant. And in this way that only these ordinary accounts, these regular types of history can do, it says so much in so few words, and you understand what was happening here in a way that you couldn't from that view from 30,000 feet. You look at an account like that and you compare it with the other accounts on all sides of that battle, and it seems to corroborate, it seems to match up with the overall way that people, ordinary people, were feeling as they went through that horror show. So it seems to stack up well with that criteria of truth and objectivity. And then I think, is there this added element where, am I using this just for shock and awe? Am I using this to be exploitative? Am I using this in a way that if that person could come back from the past and come back to now and listen to what I'm saying, would they disagree? Would they not want me to use it that way? And again, I don't think there's a way to answer that question really, but increasingly I do think that's an important question to ask as I'm creating these podcasts. And in the case of using that Charles May letter home, I hope that if Charles May could come back today, he wouldn't view that as an exploitation. It captures something that is just amazingly human at the center, at the core of all of us. And I think if you look around the world at people that have read that letter or listened to it in a podcast or come across it on their own, it's made the world a better place. It's made people more thoughtful. I know for me at least, it's just had this amazing impact. And I hope he would be okay with me using it, but I can't know for sure. So it looks like this episode isn't going to end up being super long, but I did want to give everybody listening maybe just a chance to get a little bit of a behind the scenes look at the way that I approach this particular issue when I'm making a podcast or thinking about history. And it was cool for me just to be able to do an episode like this where I'm just kind of thinking about the way I approach things and maybe is there any way I can change or make things better or tighten up my approach a little bit, especially as it relates to this struggle I often have with the human element versus remaining objective and this larger sort of theme of exploitation in history. I'd be curious to hear your all's thoughts on this. If anyone has any, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I really appreciate everything that you all have done for me just in listening and supporting the podcast. And as always, thanks for listening.